Welcome to episode 159 of the Microsoft Cloud IT Pro podcast, recorded live January 3, 2020. This is a show about Office 365 and Azure from the perspective of IT pros and end users, where we discuss a topic or recent news and how it relates to you. In our first episode, recorded in 2020, we talk about a couple of recent Azure news items. We start things off with Azure Spot VMs and then transition to a discussion about Azure AD Connect cloud provisioning. I see my waveforms going up and down like a heartbeat. Bum.
Ba-bum. Oh, they only go ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum if you go ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum.
Bum.
Yeah.
Bum, bum, bum. Like that.
There you go. Welcome to the waveform.
That's my heartbeat. So which waveforms can I create with my voice?
You can create all the waveforms with your voice. As long as they're talking about cloudy things, you'll be just fine.
So then I have audio waves creating other waveforms.
That's very meta.
We should not have recorded this on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock.
Well,
that was probably a bad choice.
I should not have overslept this morning. And if I had been up at my normal 7 a.m., would have been able to make the normal recording time. But
hey, I had nothing to do with that.
Life doesn't come.
Except that maybe next time I'll just call you at 7 a.m.
There we go. That's going to be the plan.
Except do not disturb set on your phone.
I do, which is why I woke up to a bunch of messages from you.
Oh my, what am I going to do with you? Hey Scott, welcome to 2020.
Yes!
We are officially 3 days in.
We made it.
Can we start the jokes about Perfect Vision now?
Sure.
Okay.
Perfect Vision, no. Barbara Walters, you name it.
Oh yeah. Maybe we should have skipped 2020 and gone straight to 2021. I don't know. I have nothing.
I think you're thinking about it too hard. So if you have nothing and I have nothing, we should probably get into more nothing.
More nothing about my music that you can't hear.
No, we're not going to talk about Amazon HD music.
Amazon HD music, I can tell the difference. You may not be able to. I'm kind of a fan. But to be fair, I do have the audio mixer running through studio monitors that can go up to 192,000 hertz in terms of that frequency thing, the format. So I can get really good audio out of my laptop, which does enable me to hear the difference between Amazon HD Music and Spotify. I did a track-to-track comparison. Definitely an audible difference for me.
Well, I'm glad you're happy.
I am. Merry Christmas to me.
Yeah, not sure I have much to contribute to that one. My ears were shot a long time ago. You're actually lucky that I can hear you. Or maybe I'm lucky that I can hear you.
I don't know that anybody's lucky to be able to hear me. Everyone on your team is unique. So is SkillMeUp.com. Only SkillMeUp provides the bridge from fundamentals to certification paths to advanced skills to accelerate digital transformation with one subscription and 5 ways to learn. Start your free pilot today and supercharge your IT and Microsoft Azure skills by visiting skillmeup.com/pilot or click the link in the show notes below. I'll let you contribute Azure stuff. Should we talk about some Azure news that we just kind of went and handpicked out of some relatively recent announcements? Not all of these are brand new, but some of them we haven't talked about. I guess they're all, at least from the beginning of December, they're all new within the last 30 days or so.
Well, they're new to you, so that's what counts.
Yes. There are lots of things that are new to me. There's a lot of changes. Which one should we start with? Azure Spot VMs. These were interesting.
Yeah, we can start with Spot VMs. Sure. So Spot VMs are a feature that are going to supersede what used to be known as Low Priority VMs. So it's some new functionality, kind of a superset of functionality that extends Low Priority VMs and extends them in a way that Low Priority VMs are now gone. So those disappeared on January 1st, 2020, and Spot VMs are now in the form of preview. So they bring some new things to the table that Low Priority VMs didn't have, particularly in variable pricing. So if you're familiar maybe with Spot Compute from other cloud providers like AWS, it's a pretty similar model here. You're going to spin up a virtual machine, and you're going to say, I would basically like to borrow what is currently unused compute at a reduced price because Microsoft doesn't need it for another customer at that given point in time. But should another customer come along and be willing to pay full price for the compute that I'm not willing to pay full price for it, then go ahead and kick me out, get rid of my Spot instance and just evict me. So deallocate my workload and I'm done. I've exceeded whatever my potential rule was around maximum price when I allocated the VM in the first place, and then you just come out of the pool. You can get notifications and things like that for eviction. So if you're doing particularly transient workloads, maybe you're just doing things like, maybe you use like burstable compute today to do batch processing, or, you tried containers, maybe you tried like ACI, but it wasn't big enough because it wasn't a full VM and it had some other restrictions on it. Something like this might work for you because you've already got batch processing in place that can support things like a VM being shut down with little to no notice.
I was going to ask, so kind of along those lines, because obviously having a VM shut down in the middle of a workload can be very detrimental to said workload. How much warning do you actually get that you're going to get kicked out? Your VM's just going to get deallocated out from underneath you?
Well, you can have up to 30 seconds of notice.
Oh, so nice and long.
Well,
plenty of time.
Listen, this isn't for like shutting down a SharePoint server gracefully kind of thing, but it is for that custom bursty kind of data processing that you might have going out there. So you need to do bigger compute or bigger data, and you don't want to commit to HPC clusters, or you just don't have the budget to go into some of those other things. This gives you a way to just burst into Microsoft's unused compute. And now we're talking about virtual machines. So a VM is never just a VM, right? A VM is the virtual machine definition. It is also things like its NIC and its persistent storage for maybe OS and data disk and things like that. All that stuff stays around. So basically, if you're running a single instance Spot VM, the VM itself just gets deallocated, but any of your other resources like your NIC with its static public IP, the disk that was associated with it, OS and data, all those other things, they continue to sit there. So you're still going to be billed for those, but those tend to be a lot cheaper than running CPU and RAM, and you're kind of all set and ready to go. So single instance, you just get deallocated. If you run Spot instances inside of virtual machine scale sets, so kind of that capability to do horizontal scaling, scale in and scale out automatically or on a schedule, things like that, you can run in basically two forms of an eviction policy. So with that single instance where your policy is always going to be deallocate, you can run in deallocation mode. So your VM scale set, say you were running at like 5 instances and one of them gets kicked out because, you were evicted. You'd say, hey, I'm going to run in deallocation mode, and it works just like a single instance VM. It comes down, goes offline, the disk and things stay around. Or you can also have eviction policies that delete with VM scale sets, and then your VM and all of its associated resource, so the disks, the NIC, all those kinds of things go away. So should you want to keep your data, always deallocate. If you're doing something where like I'm processing a data and as soon as the record is transactionally committed, then hey, you've committed the record. Like who cares if it gets shut off? Just delete it and maybe recreate it later.
Right. So you could almost kind of treat these, this may be a bit of a stretch, but almost like you would a Docker container where it's working on something, and if it gets kicked out, you just spin up a new one, or it's doing those short transactional things where it doesn't really matter if all of a sudden this VM just disappears out from under the workload.
Yeah, that's just about it. So, it's not for everything. Like you're not going to run your domain controllers or Exchange or SharePoint or even your Docker Swarm cluster, things like that on top of this. But for your custom applications, it might make total sense to just have that be the way things run. So it can be a little bit weird here because you can go to create a Spot VM and you might not actually have the capability to even turn your Spot VM on because Spot is 100% dependent on used compute. You might start to boot your Spot VM up, and while there were resources available when you started to boot, so you were allocated, you were placed onto a host, and you started to go through the motion, you might not make it all the way through the motion, because if I'm a paying customer and come in behind you and Microsoft needs it, they'll just go ahead and
just deallocate it before it even starts up.
Just go ahead and have that happen. It's not too bad. Like if you do deallocate and that's your policy, you're just going to do manual restarts for the VM. So you might see, like you'll probably want some other kind of automated process out there. Say you've got like a single instance Spot VM that does that record processing for you. Well, once it shuts down, you might want to have Azure automation pull its status like once a minute and say, hey, if it's deallocated, try and start it again. And then come back a minute later, hey, if it's deallocated, try and start it again. And just watch it that way to, have it come through and get to where it needs to be.
And that was going to be one of my next questions then, is once it's deallocated, there's currently no settings with these to automatically boot it back up once there's resources again. That's something you're going to have to create is if you want these to try to spin back up and watch for free resources, it's something you're going to have to create as that process to turn these back on once they get deallocated, or try to turn them back on once they get deallocated.
Correct. Yep.
All right. And even those scale sets then aren't always dependable, because if your scale sets and everything's, in theory, you could have 10 VMs running all in some type of cluster or scale set. And if all the resources get sucked up at the same time, in theory, all 10 of your VMs could shut down all at once or deallocate all at once.
Correct. And as it stands today, you cannot have a scale set that mixes regular non-Spot VMs and Spot VMs as well. So it's basically an attribute or a property on the virtual machine definition, that spot pricing flag, which is set at creation time. So once you've created that thing, it's got to be one or the other. Say you had something where you wanted part of your cluster to be up all the time and another part that could be spotty. Well, in that case, you might have to create two different VM scale sets and maybe two different load balancers with maybe another load balancer or another solution in front of them to get all that traffic into where it needed to be based on what was actually up and running. It really depends on your app. Like, is it something that does data processing by pulling and then transactional commits? Is it something where it needs to run a website and like say it's like presenting like a data processing API or something to a set of applications? Do you need web servers on it? Like, what does it actually have to be?
Yeah, definitely a lot of things to take into consideration before you just spin up one of these Spot VMs and start running workloads on it. You're going to get some cheap VMs, but you're going to have to put some thought into how you're going to architect whatever solution's on it.
Yeah, you are going to get some cheaper VMs than you would have potentially had before.
Hey, you can save up to 90% if you do like a 3-year reserved instance on
Yeah, so that'd be an interesting one, like where you can fall out with some of that, doing like RIs and things like that within a series, because it's just it's not a specific type of VM, right? It's still your DS,
right?
It's still your DS2 V2. You're just saying it's a Spot VM instead of a non-Spot VM.
Right. Sorry, I was looking at this wrong. The Spot, that's just payment options. It's comparing Spot to 3-year reserved. Doesn't look like you could do like a 3-year reserved Spot VM.
There is an option with price with these. So it's not just about allocating it and waiting for you to get kicked out. So that's the capacity model of eviction. The other model that you can do is price or capacity. So you can basically set a maximum price, and then if you hit that maximum price, they'll go ahead and evict you out before they've run out of compute capacity within the data centers. So you do have some variability in how much this potentially costs you, how long they run, things like that.
Got it.
You've got to pick the workload and find the right workload for it. So this is a good value add, because it gives you a compete for similar functionality that's in AWS, and then it gives you some different options that you potentially haven't had before.
So if you do like the pricing option, is it I start at just looking at Spot instance, so like for an AV2, it starts at 0.7 cents per hour. If you do a maximum price, do you start at that lower price, and as demand grows, your price will increase until you hit your maximum so that you can potentially stay up longer because your pricing is adjusting based on demand?
Potentially.
Got it. So that's how that pricing works, is it'll just ramp up your price as high as you will let it go. And as long as you're under your maximum price, that VM will stay on and your price will just kind of fluctuate with demand.
Yeah, it's kind of like buying a stock. So you want to do like a call on a stock based, like I only want to buy it or sell it when it hits this certain price.
Yep.
Same kind of thing here.
Got it. Huh. Interesting.
Yep.
I have not played with any of these yet. Although I don't know that I have a workload that I would play with it on.
No, I think you'd be into more like dedicated hosts or something like that.
Yeah, or the burstables. The burstables would be okay for some of the things I've done with it.
Burstables are still there.
Right, so I could still go use burstables. I don't know that I have any workloads for Spot VMs at this point in time. Need to find something to do with them. As IT professionals in the cloud era, sometimes it feels like we don't speak the same language as the rest of the organization. So when stakeholders from finance or other departments start asking about a specific project or team's Azure costs, they don't always realize how much work is involved in obtaining that information, sifting through cluttered CSVs and a complex mess of metadata in order to manually create custom views and reports. It's a real headache. On top of helping you understand and reduce your organization's overall Azure spend, ShareGate Overcast lets you group resources into meaningful cost hubs and map them to real-world business scenarios. This way, you can track costs in the way that makes most sense with your corporate structure, whether it's by product, business unit, team, or otherwise. It's a flexible, intuitive, and business-friendly way of tracking Azure infrastructure costs, and it's only available in ShareGate Overcast. Find out more on sharegate.com/ITPro. On from VMs, there was an interesting one that came up with Azure AD back on, when was this blog posted? December 5. So it was about a month ago now, but we had talked about it and haven't really talked about it on the show. And this is a new ability to bring disconnected Active Directory domains into Azure AD with just a few clicks, which is actually the heading of the article. But this is a new feature that's in public preview. It's Azure AD Connect Cloud Provisioning. And I've actually seen this with a few of my clients where this would be helpful, but this is it's essentially a new client that you can go, a new client, new connector that you can go install on different domain controllers, different environments, to be able to account for a scenario that you cannot currently do with Azure AD Connect. So Azure AD Connect, if you want to sync multiple forests, multiple domains into a single Azure AD tenant. So let's say, for instance, and this is where I tend to see it, this is a scenario they gave in the article, is you have company A, and company A goes and acquires company B. So now you have company A domain and you have company B domain, and you want to bring them into the same Office 365 environment. Today, if you want to sync all of those accounts from both companies' domain forests into a single Azure AD tenant for Office 365 for Azure, all those forests have to be set up so that they can all be reached from a single Azure AD Connect server. So you have to have appropriate trust set up. You have to have appropriate networks configured so that your single Azure AD Connect server can reach all of those domains, all those forests from both Company A and Company B to sync everybody together. That was the way it used to be. Now, with this new Azure AD Cloud Connect provisioning, you have the ability to take a completely disconnected Active Directory domain and sync those users using this provisioning client into your Azure Active Directory tenant without setting up all those trusts and making sure it's all reachable from that single Azure Active Directory Connect Sync server.
So I just want to just clarify. So when we're saying disconnected, really we're talking about disconnected forests or forests that don't have existing trust relationships between them.
Yes. Not disconnected from the internet, not like an air-gapped
correct Active
Directory environment, but two non-trusted Active Directory environments that both still have access to Office 365, to the internet, et cetera.
Yeah, they still need to get outside. They still need to be able to talk to Azure AD. It's not like it's going through another proxy or things like that. You're just saying, I want to be able to do identity projections for certain types of entities, users and groups primarily, from this on-premises Active Directory, and specifically Active Directory, not an LDAP directory, and go ahead and send it up to the cloud.
Yeah, because there are some requirements there. Like when you said primarily users and groups, it's really more like only users and groups.
Well, contacts too.
Okay, and contacts, because there are some limitations here. So there's a link that we'll put in the show notes that goes in and compares your traditional Azure Active Directory Connect Sync client to your Azure Active Directory Connect Cloud Provisioning client in terms of what functionality is available between the two and how those two will function. So there's a lot of stuff that's the same in terms of support for user objects, group objects, contact objects. But one thing you can't get is devices. So if you're going to use this new Cloud Connect provisioning, your devices are not going to get pushed up to your Azure Active Directory tenant. So you won't get those hybrid Azure AD joined devices from that Active Directory environment that's disconnected from the one running Azure Active Directory sync. And this really is a provisioning push too. There's also no write back. So any of that password write back, the ones I specifically call out, passwords, devices, groups, from the write back from Azure AD back to on-prem, none of that write back two-way communication works. This is literally just a push from a Active Directory domain into your Azure AD tenant.
Correct. And it's a push from a different agent as well. So you're installing the cloud provisioning agent on that disparate domain or forest. You're not installing another version of AD Connect and managing another configuration on top of that locally. So all the configuration is done in Azure AD, and then you just download this agent and run this agent, and it pulls on premises, and then it sends that information out to Azure Active Directory so that then your users can start to do what they need to do. But if you're already, I can see where this is super helpful, not for just like M&A, mergers and acquisitions, things like that. Certainly if you can't have your domains talking to each other, or you ever think that they're going to come apart in that way, but maybe you have something like 2 instances of ADFS, you can still do per domain federation, specifically like per verified domain. So I've got ben'susers.com in one verified domain and scott'susers.com in another. We can actually, through home realm discovery, still go ahead and do things like federated authentication, hit our own identity providers, and everything just kind of like works and comes together, which is kind of cool. So if I bought somebody, I'm doing ADFS on my side, but you're doing Okta already, then we really don't have much to do other than bring your users over into this new Azure AD tenant with some of the tooling, and we continue to do home realm discovery, and you can keep using Okta and kind of doing all those things and getting them to where they need to be.
Yeah, so there's lots of options. One thing I haven't seen in here, do you know, this was another one before I jump into that, is customer defined AD attributes. So those customer defined AD attributes, those don't sync with this provisioning tool, which was another one. And there was one other one I noticed I wanted to mention. Filter on object attributes. So you don't have filter out certain users based on object attributes. This is just essentially take all my users and groups and just shove them up into Azure Active Directory. But one thing, and it's not in this article, could you potentially do this? So let's say you go through a merger acquisition, you shove them all up there, and then over time you shift where that domain is trusted. Could you shift from using the cloud provisioning into the Azure AD sync and have everything stay connected? Or do you have any idea how that would work?
I would have to play with it and see. I don't know how they treat potentially a cloud provisioned object versus an Azure AD Connect provisioned object. And if there's something that goes on there, like if I disconnect cloud provisioning, do my users go away? Do they get like cleaned up? Because if they stayed, but they were still cloud provisioned, could I then do, like you said, a trust and then bring them into my current Azure AD Connect configuration and just do like a UPN soft match or like a proxy address soft match, whatever it happens to be, to make things come together? I don't know. Could be kind of fun to like break and see if we could play with it. You want to set up a couple domains? And
maybe we should go stand up some Spot VMs running Active Directory and try to set this up and see how badly we can break it.
Oh, I'd be willing to bet we can break it like super badly. That shouldn't take too much.
No, I bet we could. But it definitely makes for an interesting scenario or an interesting solution. And again, I've had some of those clients that end up with multiple domains, and the trusts cause all kinds of issues, where having something like this to push users up and avoid some of the issues we ran into with trusts and UPNs and all of that could come in very handy. I definitely want to test out that flip from one to the other, because especially in a merger and acquisition, I can see that being a very real possibility of wanting to shift from one solution to another.
Yeah, I think it depends on how you bring them in and sometimes what the plan is with them, right? Like when you're combining tenants, it's always just a weird way of the world anyway. And particularly like when you have two organizations, like you buy another one that already has Office 365 and Azure AD, it's just kind of a little bit of a messy scenario, right? There's no good...
That was a very pleasant way to put that.
Well, but there's no good like clean way to make that stuff happen, right? Because it's not just identity at that point. Then you're moving other resources that need to come along with it. It might be mailboxes, SharePoint sites, could be planner plans. Like you're trying to do all this stuff that it was just never meant to do in this world. So I think for the most part, you'd probably count yourself lucky that your identity just happened to work and get it to where it needed to be.
Yeah, I was going to say, you made merging Office 365 tenants initially sound way easier or way less painful than it.
Oh no, it's super painful. I would never.
Ugly.
Yeah, I wouldn't wish it upon anybody, but stuff does happen. You did mention that you can't do filtering based on attributes.
Yes,
true, but yeah, just to be clear, you can do filtering based on security groups or based on organizational units as well, one or more OUs within your source directory. So it's got to be one or the other, either security groups or either organizational units, but it is possible to configure that filtering. And again, you're driving all that configuration just on the cloud side of things with the provisioning agent or the cloud provisioning agent configuration.
Yep. When it comes to email, Outlook and Office 365 are fantastic, but sometimes there are things you'd like to do that aren't implemented. Sperry Software creates Outlook add-ins and Office 365 services that fill in these gaps. For instance, there are Outlook add-ins to automatically print emails and or attachments, save emails to PDF, send out recurring emails, or how about a warning when you're going to do a reply to all instead of a normal reply? Find these and many more email productivity solutions. Get started today by visiting www.sperrysoftware.com/cloudit. And the other probably important one to mention too is this also does not support Exchange hybrid configuration, which, I mean, it kind of makes sense because there's a lot of proxy addresses.
But those are those extended attributes too. So think all your like MS Exchange, blah, 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 the however many, I forget the exact number, but there's a ton of them in there.
A lot.
When Exchange extends your schema that way, and all that information needs to be in Azure AD or needs to be synced through so it can be used in Exchange Online, for all those hybrid scenarios, then yeah, like that makes sense. But this isn't for the people that you're going to potentially give mailboxes and things to. Like organizations that are set up that way are potentially going to have to figure something else out. I could see this being great for like, I bought the other company and I really need to bring them quickly into like my cloud enabled SaaS apps that I do all my authentication through Azure AD for regulatory and compliance reasons, right? Because you should be able to like next your way through this thing and in 10 minutes have it set up and done.
Right. So here's the other interesting one with this one too. We could just keep going on this. Azure Active Directory Connect, we referenced several times. You just have a single server. This one does support multiple active agents for high availability. So if you do want to always be syncing those users up, put some high availability in that sync provision process in there. This could also be a solution, again, assuming some of these other features don't limit you from doing it, like the password write back. You could use these to get some high availability in terms of syncing those users and their passwords up, but you would have to be doing either federated authentication, the seamless single sign-on, or password hash. This one doesn't support the pass-through authentication.
Yes. Yeah. So you gotta, I think that's what I was trying to get to with, like, you gotta watch yourself sometimes with the matrix of supported features, because you might go in there and say, oh, it does seamless SSO, but it's not seamless SSO with PTA. It's seamless SSO with federation, and assuming you've got all that other stuff set up.
Yep. So we'll make sure we link this matrices is plural. This matrix of supported features in the show notes, so you can go through it and review it if this is something you think you might use or want to take a look at.
Yeah, no, I think it's also definitely in preview. It is called out very heavily as preview, like if you try and onboard through the portal or things like that. But it is kind of sitting out there and ready to go. So I think between this and some of the other announcements they've had around Azure AD for being able to do things like transition users through like federated authentication into like a PTA or like a cloud authenticated model and still do SSO and things like that, it starts to give you a little bit of a decent life cycle for your users, especially once they get it all wired up in the end.
Yep, absolutely. All right. With that, should we go enjoy our Friday evenings?
Yes, we should.
It is 5 o'clock.
It is 5 o'clock somewhere.
Not quite. Well, it's almost 5 o'clock here.
On to the next thing. Into the breach.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, go enjoy your weekend.
All right.
And we will talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Ben.
All right. Thanks, Scott. If you enjoyed the podcast, go leave us a 5-star rating in iTunes. It helps to get the word out so more IT pros can learn about Office 365 and Azure. If you have any questions you want us to address on the show or feedback about the show, feel free to reach out via our website, Twitter, or Facebook. Thanks again for listening and have a great day.